Good afternoon, everyone, and we have a special guest with us, Ms. Marlene, who's a head of transfer pricing and tax administration at OECD. Thank you so much for speaking to us, and a very interesting panel discussion this morning. The progress that has been made in last 2 years, particularly on BEPS, has been very interesting, and you also mentioned personally, it started with transfer pricing and then sort of evolved on various other issues. Personally speaking, how has been the experience in last 2 years? And BEPS has been receiving some criticism. Of course, getting everyone on the same board is not easy. What has been your personal experience?
So my personal experience has been amazing. I came into the OECD when we didn't know there would be base erosion and profit shifting project. And then it started kind of rolling. I think we did a very amazing job. I'm very proud of all the countries participating and them being able to reach the agreements that they have reached. And as you will see in October, there is really very meaningful progress that we have reached, especially on transfer pricing. But as the diagnostics show, the issues were much broader, and we also reached kind of good conclusions, also consensus of some of the other issues. So we reach consensus, we have good outcomes. Some are different than others. We have minimum standards,
Sure.
We have rules, we have best practices. But all of them are very meaningful and based on a consensus.
Right. You mentioned about transfer pricing, and one of the underlying theme in BEPS is that transfer pricing will go with the value creation, and one of the aspect and a greater thrust which is being provided now is on the risk, identification of the risk, and then the valuation of the risk as well. In theory, it does make sense, of course, but in practice, identification and more importantly valuation could pose some practical challenges. Will OECD come out with some specific guidance on these aspects as well? Do you think, first of all, will there be a greater challenge in addressing this aspect, risk aspect specifically?
I don't think so. I think we had a public consultation on risk, and there people already said we shouldn't go looking for each and every minor risk. So we are saying what you should do is identify the economically significant risks. And those are the risks that these multinational companies already have very sharply in their perspective, because that is their profit-making power. Managing those risks is at the core of their business. So identifying them, to me, seems not the most difficult task. Sure. Then valuing them, and if risk is about where do you allocate the upward profit potential, but also the losses. Normally, risk should be neutral. You know, it shouldn't have a lot of value at the time, at the ex-ante time. The difference is the exposed kind of the way it realizes is going to be where the profit is. So allocation of the risk is the main issue, not kind of valuation of the risk. And we have a very good framework of allocating risk to the right entity.
Right. I think the developing countries, and I specifically remember Indian Competent Authority saying a couple of years ago, risk is a very important aspect. Somewhere this debate is now also moving on whether the source versus residence country taxation rules are being relooked at. And Parul...
Yeah, right. And, we heard on the panel that basically the intention is not really to move to a source-based taxation, but it's just coincidental that it's moving to source-based. And, there was also a remark that it's more about fixing the boundaries rather than, leaving them fluid. So what really are your thoughts on source versus residence-based taxation? Do you really think that the outcome of this project is going to ultimately result in just simply source-based taxation?
I don't think so. As the action plan said, the report said, the intention is to reinstate the intentions that were underlying current tax treaties. The ones who concluded the tax treaties had something in mind, but the way it was implemented and turned out was totally different. It didn't work the same way. So what we are doing is reinstating that. And that reinstating may lead to indeed source countries in some situations having more taxation right, but also headquarter countries. If it's now in a low tax jurisdiction, and the headquarter country is doing all the research and development activities, the profits will be shifted back to the headquarter countries. So I don't think there is a bias towards source or residence. It's reinstating kind of the boundaries that where they meant to be by changing the rules a bit.
Right. Specifically speaking about the mandatory multilateral instrument, and one of the key aspects for implementation of all the BEPS proposals is the culmination of the multilateral instrument. And today morning we heard, and even earlier, US specifically has mentioned that as of now they are not on board when it comes to multilateral instrument. How do you propose to build a consensus around multilateral instrument to make it really work in a meaningful manner, especially if a country like US opts out of it?
Well, I think on the multilateral we need to have consensus on the content of the measures. We don't need to have all countries adopting all measures. If you look at the US, they already have fulfilled the minimum standard on treaty abuse. They already have their anti-hybrid rules. So, you know, on some things they don't need the multilateral instrument. And what Bob Stack said, therefore it's not a good way to use our resources to participate. And for now we're not participating in the multilateral instrument. But therefore what the instrument is meant to do is to implement the BEPS outcomes, the treaty outcomes, in bilateral treaties in one go instead of renegotiating for 20 years. And countries can use that in a flexible way, the way they see fit. But there's a huge interest in that. We already have 87 plus countries that have said they would like to be part of this process. So that's a huge interest. So no doubt countries need it, will use it, and it will be there at the end of 2016.
Right. So countries, you're right, countries are really watching with much interest, you know, how the work on the multilateral instrument is going to develop, because that is what they perceive to be, the implementation of the BEPS project as such. You talked about the flexibility which may be accorded under the instrument. So as such, you know, based on the preliminary work which may have been done on the multilateral instrument, and everyone is really waiting for, some draft paper to come out on the multilateral instrument. But as such, when you talk about flexibility, will it mean that countries will be flexible, will have the flexibility to choose a particular article over another in their treaties, or how is the flexibility really going to work?
In several ways. For example, if you look at treaty abuse, we have a minimum standard, but that minimum standard can be fulfilled in different ways. You can have a principal purpose test, you can have a limitation on benefits together with an anti-conduit rule. So in the multilateral instruments, countries will need to be able to choose between the two. But countries will have to fulfill the multilateral instrument. Countries already fulfilling the multilateral instrument, such as, for example, the US, don't need this. So they will not participate on that element because they already have it. So that is the flexibility on the one hand. On the other hand, on permanent establishments, for example, or on mandatory binding arbitration, it will not be a minimum standard. It will not be obligatory. Some countries will do it, some will not. And that flexibility will also be reflected in the instrument. So it will need to be a very kind of flexible instrument, allowing to tailor it to the needs of the specific country, what they want to do and what they want to be adapted in their treaties.
Right. Last question, Marlies. October first week is when the G20 meeting is happening, and your recommendations will be released before that. The next key aspect is the implementation. What are the 2 or 3 important steps that will happen in terms of implementing the final recommendations? And what if, and I'm just being devil's advocate over here, what if one of the countries do not wish to actually implement any of these recommendations? What happens in such a scenario?
No, it will depend on the outcomes. As I said, there are different outcomes. The transfer pricing rules will be implemented through the transfer pricing guidelines, and they will therefore be applicable through the treaties themselves. When you're looking at domestic rules, people will have to adapt their domestic rules. And when you're talking about kind of the treaty issues, some will be minimum standards. And there will be a commitment to implement. On the minimum standards especially, also the one on dispute resolution, there will be a much closer monitoring mechanism to see if everyone meets its minimum standard than on other issues. So there will be different kind of intensities of monitoring going on, but there will also be general monitoring to see if everything works the way it should work. Then on some of the issues, but likely on kind of the whole project, there will also be kind of a time where it will be assessed whether it works. For example, country by country reporting, where there will be a review in 2020, where we will see whether the threshold works, whether the categories that are reflected in the country by country report works. So there are also these kind of testing moments in there. So with that, there is going to be a close watch on implementation. And it's also very important that the group that has worked on the standards will also work together on implementation. So they have committed to that in these areas.
Thank you so much, Marlies, for speaking to us. Thank you. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Okay.